Okay, welcome to the second session of the conference. This is the first of two sessions focused on the demand side. And the demand side here, what we're thinking about is the parents, the community, and more generally, who are thinking about sending children to school. And in this of the first two sessions, what we're looking at is the impact of interventions, reforms that give, generally speaking, greater agency to parents in the community. So we're going to look at three papers that are encouraging school management committees to spend funds or to draw up and use scorecards or report cards. And then another intervention by Jishnu that's looking at testing students and providing information to parents. So the first of the papers by Minahil here is going to talk about school councils in Punjab, Pakistan. This is an intriguing paper in as much as these school councils were not using all of the funds that were available to them. So the government implemented a reform program, the School Council Mobilization Program, where members that received this intervention were encouraged to spend funds. And the fascinating thing in this study is that the increased spending didn't in fact drive greater learning. And we're going to hear about the mechanisms that might be behind that. Sarah Kabay is going to give our second paper on this theme, and she's going to explore how and why school-based management initiatives might work, following on from previous research by Peter Sunils, who is somewhere in the room, and other co-authors who previously looked at a school report card program and found that a participatory version of that intervention, where members of the school council were asked to draw up the scorecards in the first place, had a greater impact on student learning in Uganda. And she's going to interrogate the mechanisms again behind why that might have been a success. And then finally, Jishnu is going to talk to us about a long-term follow-up on a test and report card intervention in Punjab, Pakistan. And he's going to talk about how the improvements that are seen, both in terms of higher test scores and lower private school fees, come primarily through improvements in existing public schools. Better information produces productivity improvements in those existing schools. And he's going to talk about the fact that better teachers are teaching bigger classes. So those are three papers all around this idea of giving greater agency to the demand side. But before that, we're going to have a paper that's not on that theme, just in case you were wondering. So Michelle is going to talk to us about what we can and can't infer from looking at learning profiles. The reason she's talking in this session is because we had a fourth paper on the demand side theme that unfortunately couldn't be presented, so she's very graciously stepped in. So we will start with Michelle, then move on to the theme. If it's okay with you, we'll collect questions across the four papers at the end, just for the sake of efficiency. So over to you, Michelle.
Okay, great. Thanks, Claire. So as Claire, am I on? Yep. As Claire alluded to, I'm going to be talking about simulating learning and trying to understand learning outcomes and profiles that we observe in the data. So we're going to develop a formal model for learning profiles with applications for understanding teacher value added. And this is work that I've been doing with Lant Pritchett. So learning profiles show that learning is highly varied across countries and on average is quite low. Demographic and health surveys data, for example, shows that girls with 6 years of schooling and no further. Literacy rates across these more than 50 countries vary everywhere from less than 10% literate to upwards of nearly 100% literacy in Rwanda. So the amount of learning that occurs over the same number of years of schooling just varies massively across countries. We also know that learning varies substantially within countries. This is one of what could be any number of examples, but this is pulling from Osser and Uwezo data showing that in India, for example, children by about age 10 or 11, those in the bottom 40th percentile by wealth are about half as likely to be able to do a simple division problem as those in the top 20%. So large variations also within countries. And then finally, recent Pisa D data shows that developing countries are far behind any kind of universal basic mastery goal. So kind of in absolute terms, we know this learning is just very low. This is just showing a contrast between the Netherlands, an OECD country, and Guatemala, which participated in Pisa D, showing that about 97% of 15-year-olds in Guatemala would be considered low skill by OECD standards. And almost none are in these top 3 levels of PISA. So just very low learning outcomes on an absolute level. And if anything, Guatemala performed a little bit better than some of the other countries in Pisa D. So what explains these learning trajectories? Right, so learning outcomes are driven by the initial distribution of student skills and an instructional process that's going to impart some level of learning for a student at each point in that distribution. What we do is develop a formal model that characterizes this instructional process. We're then going to use that model to simulate learning profiles and show that we can use the model to simulate observed learning profiles like some of the ones I just showed. And then finally, kind of the crux of the presentation today is to show the implications of this model for understanding teacher value added and measures of observed learning and outcomes, showing that multiple factors, not just teacher ability, determine observed TVA, which has important implications for improving learning. So building on work by Beatty and Pritchett from 2012, we construct a potential pedagogical function. So this is a PPF that models the amount that a child at each point in the student distribution learns during an increment of schooling, so like a year of schooling. And it's characterized by 5 elements. So we have height, which is the maximum that can be learned, the shape, which determines how much children at different points in the distribution learn, the range, which is the range of student abilities that learn anything. So you could have a PPF, say, that's targeted at long division, and children who can't recognize their numbers are not going to learn anything from that classroom experience. The location or centeredness is the level of student skills that the PPF is targeted for or centered on. And then finally, the pace is the amount that the PPF shifts up for each year of schooling, so that can be thought of as the curricular pace. So this is our simplest PPF. It's a rectangular shape, but I'm just going to show this pretty briefly just to kind of hone the intuition behind how this works. So this is a PPF in which all children within the range of the PPF learn the same. So the learning of any student I of initial skill level S is going to be a function of the height of the PPF and the range of the PPF, which we just define by the endpoints to show that. So all this is showing is that learning is going to be 0 if you're outside the range on the low end. It's going to be 0 if you're outside the range on the high end, greater than B. And if you're inside the range, you're going to learn H max. It's a constant. Just in this example, everyone's going to learn the same. So this is what that looks like illustrated. Again, this is just kind of honing the intuition. I've overlaid it over a student distribution to show how they interact. So in this case, all the distribution can be thought of as a classroom. Everyone in that class is inside the range of the PPF, so they're all going to learn something. And in this case, they're all going to learn 50 units. They're learning the same amount. So this is, and the unit, we've kind of calibrated it. You can think of that as points on a Pisa scale. Like if you spent 10 years in school and learned 50 points each year, you'd end up at 500. But that's just for illustration. So that's our simplest variation of it. We know that's not a realistic model, right? Because we know that not everyone's going to learn the same amount in a year of schooling. So we move on to a model that allows for that variation in learning per the learning within the classroom. And so this is a shape in which all children learn at least a minimum amount, but high performers learn more. This is a shape that's also able to replicate mean OECD PISA scores. And so we can see that instruction increases linearly with initial ability. The height in this one is the minimum height's 30, the max height is 52. And if we iterate that for 12 years of schooling, we get that mean of 500 and standard deviation of 100 because we're allowing for the variation in learning after 10 years of schooling. So that's kind of our setup for how we're thinking of learning across these different parameters. We're next going to use that to simulate learning outcomes. And so schooling is a series of instructional processes, and we're going to use the model to simulate 12 years of schooling. So we're going to take the PPF, we're going to apply it to that initial distribution, everyone's going to learn some amount dictated by the PPF, and the distribution is going to shift up for the next year of schooling. Then we're going to shift the PPF up according to the curriculum, which may or may not be aligned with how much the students learned. And we're going to apply it again. And we're going to do that 12 times to replicate, to be 12 years of schooling. From that, now we can trace out a learning profile, right? So now we can start to see what the learning profile looks like. And so we're going to do an average learning profile over those years and disaggregated learning profiles that lets us see how students at different points in the initial distribution are affected by that learning experience. And so this is just showing how this works. So again, we can think of this distribution as the class that enters grade 1. The PPF is what's taught in grade 1. If you're at 100, you're going to learn 42 points. If you're at the top tail, you're learning 52. If you're at the bottom tail, you're learning 30. And then you're going to enter grade 2 with this distribution, where if you had 100 before, now you're up here at 142. And kind of everyone has shifted up according to what they learned. So we do that 12 times. And this is kind of our showing what those simulation results can look like. So the top left is our starting point. This is the same distribution in PPF that I was showing before. And this is what it looks like after 10 years. So a couple of things that this shows is that, in this example, a minority of students have fallen outside the range of the PPF by year 10. So they're not learning anything. They haven't been able to keep pace with the curriculum. We can also see that the distribution has flattened and widened a bit because the students who were learning more have gotten out ahead. Those who are learning less have fallen behind, and we see a gradual widening of that distribution. Looking down at what this looks like for learning profiles, the average learning profile is pretty linear, pretty constant learning across all those years, but I think a little bit more interestingly, the disaggregated learning profiles, you can start to see that the high performers have a slightly steeper slope, they're learning a little bit more each year, and the bottom performers have a little bit flatter slope, they're learning a little bit less every year. And then now by grade 12, we start to see some of this within country variation in the learning outcomes that we're achieving. So we're starting to be able to replicate some what we think are kind of realistic observed learning profiles. So now we're going to use that model in the simulation process to get to our kind of main illustration. And that's to apply this to our understanding of teacher value added. So now we're going to think of the PPF as a measure of teacher value added. So every teacher has some different level of ability, some combination of their innate ability, the training they've received, the inputs that they have at their disposal, and all of that comes together to represent their ability to produce learning outcomes for the students that are in their classroom. So now the maximum height is going to represent the most learning that a teacher is able to produce. The range is the range of student abilities that a teacher is able to produce any learning for. And then, so now the area under the PPF can be thought of as that teacher's kind of total ability to produce learning outcomes for the students in their classroom. And so I start with what would be kind of the typical understanding of teacher value added, in which we're varying the height. So when we vary the heights of the PPF, we're varying the amount of learning that that teacher produces for a student at each point in the distribution. So I have three kind of varied heights here. The red is the same PPF that I used in the previous example, so that's going to be kind of our base case comparison that we use through a couple of these. So that would be considered a high TVA teacher, a high performing teacher, or kind of an average teacher in a high performing system. The green now is a teacher that has a little bit lower height. They're producing a little bit less learning for a student at each point in that distribution. And so they would be considered probably like a mediocre teacher. They'd have a little bit lower observed teacher value added. And then finally, the yellow would be considered a low performing teacher. The height is a lot lower. The area is a lot smaller. They're just producing a whole lot less learning for a student at each point in the distribution. So I take those three PPFs, I run the simulations that we ran, and I use them to produce these average learning profiles over here. And so what we can see here is that the red learning profile, again, is the same as what I was showing before. So in grade 10, we have a score of mean of 500. So that's our high-performing teacher. The green PPF produces a learning profile that's a lot flatter. So by grade 12, they've produced about less than half the learning as the red high-performing teacher has. And then the yellow PPF is extremely flat. By about grade 4, they're not producing any learning anymore. Their level of instruction was just not able to keep those students in line with the pace of the curriculum, and they've pretty much completely fallen behind where the curriculum would have them learning. And so now we see this large variation in learning outcomes that we get across these three teachers. And so if we were observing teacher value added, this is what we would observe, right? So we don't usually observe the PPF that's driving it. We're usually observing this. And from this, we would say, okay, the red is a high-performing teacher, the green is a middle-performing teacher, the yellow is a low-performing teacher. We want to do something to improve the ability of the green and the yellow teachers to produce more learning for the students that are in their classroom. Great. But this is only varying one of our parameters. And if you think back to our model, we had 5 parameters that we had the ability to work with. And so next we're going to vary one of our other parameters. And so now I have 3 PPFs where the shape and the size are constant, but the teaching's not aligned with student ability. And so now these 3 PPFs represent teachers of equal ability. So they all 3 have the same height and the same area, but we varied the centeredness of them, of their starting point. And so this could be a situation of, say, overambitious curriculum, overambitious method. They're being required to use something that forces them to teach at a level that's above the skill level of the students in their classroom. So the red is still our base case. That's the same as before. So that's our comparison point. The green now is a teacher of equal ability to that high-performing teacher, but they're off-center by a bit. So we can see the bottom tails outside the range right from the beginning. And now the yellow PPF, again, is a teacher of equal ability, same height, same area, but off-center by a lot. The majority of students are outside of the range of that PPF right from the start. And so we simulate our learning process, and we produce our average learning profiles. And so over here, now we have our average learning profiles for each of those PPFs. So what we can see is, again, the red is the same by construction. That gets us our high-performing base case comparison. And now the green, which is a teacher of equal potential ability to produce learning, same height, same area, produces substantially less learning, right? So by grade 12, they've produced about half as much learning as the red PPF. The yellow, again, is a teacher of equal ability, so same height, same area, but by grade 12, they've produced substantially less learning. So again, extremely flat. By grade 4, there's almost no learning happening. And so now we, again, have this large variation in learning outcomes from only varying the centeredness. So if we were observing teacher value added, this is what we would observe, right? So we're going to observe the learning outcomes. We're not going to observe the PPF that's driving them. And we're going to think that this is a high-performing teacher, this is a middle-performing teacher, and this is a low-performing teacher. We should do something to increase the ability of these bottom teachers to improve the amount of learning they can produce for their students. When in fact, they have the same potential ability to produce learning. It's the centeredness that's driving the low learning outcomes in their case. So just to make this point one other way, the 3 PPFs that I just showed on centeredness are kind of chosen arbitrarily for illustration, obviously. In this case, we could also vary that at any point of centeredness to start with. And so now we vary from perfectly centered all the way over to perfectly uncentered. And now the graph on the right is showing average learning outcomes in grade 10, with the x-axis a continuous measure of how centered that is. So from perfectly centered all the way down to perfectly uncentered. And from just varying the centeredness and nothing else, we can produce learning outcomes of everything from OECD scores all the way down to almost no learning occurring whatsoever. So what we're showing is that just by knowing the learning outcomes, it majorly underdetermines what the shape of the PPF looks like that's driving those learning outcomes. So the implication is that improving learning requires improving the right parameter. So a lot of interventions, say like a teacher training program, are kind of implicitly or explicitly focused on raising the height of the PPF. So if we want to increase the teacher's ability to produce learning outcomes. So if our world that we're operating in looks like the first yellow PPF, that's great, right? What that teacher needs is an increased ability to produce learning outcomes. They're producing very little learning for each student. We want to increase that ability. However, if it looks like this, then we can increase the height of that PPF all day long and have almost no impact on learning outcomes because it's not the ability that's the issue. It's the centeredness. What this yellow teacher needs is the ability to better align the curriculum or the methods with the abilities of the students in their classroom. They need better coherence behind what they're instructing and what the students are able to keep up with in that classroom. So what we're saying, what this comes together to show is that it's this alignment and coherence that matters. And so when we want to think about improving learning, we have to think about, we're not saying necessarily that these are the 5 parameters, and we're not even saying that this is the shape. Of course, there's lots of ways that we could have gotten that, but the point is that it's this alignment and the coherence that we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about what drives learning outcomes. And so just in way of conclusion, just the point that learning outcomes are driven by that, just the interaction of the distribution with the instructional process. Our PPF model is able to replicate observed learning outcomes. And then with our application to understanding teacher value added, it shows it's critical not just to consider one parameter of the PPF, such as height, but we want to consider all the parameters and adjust the one of the ones that are most critical for improving learning outcomes. Thanks.
I can go ahead and start before this loads. My name is Minahil Asim. I'm a doctoral candidate at UC Davis at the Education School. And like Abhijit, I'm going to start kind of the theme of this program with really depressing news. But I'm happy to know that there are optimists in this session. So I'm hoping that I'll get feedback that's kind of at the end of it will provide a positive picture to what we're studying here. So I look at an information dissemination intervention that targets local governance institutions in Pakistan. So I'm going to look at what the impact of that information on outcomes that are targeted directly through the intervention, and then to longer-term outcomes like student test scores. So this is kind of the structure of my presentation. I'm going to first talk about Pakistan in general, then I'm going to specifically talk about the school council program that I'm looking at. Then I'll move on to kind of looking at the theory of change, a bit about the timeline and data, what identification I use, and then the results and discussion. So I'm going to kind of leave the results to the end to keep you guessing. So Punjab in Pakistan, it's the most populous province in the country. There are 36 districts with about 52,000 primary, middle, and high schools. The schools are segregated by sex and gender, but as I learned from Dave Evans, I should report results based on gender, which I don't currently. So school councils in Pakistan were established under school-based management or decentralization reforms, but there was a formal policy that was kind of constituted in 2007. So these school councils kind of comprise of parents, the head teacher, and some members of the community who can read and write. And they're supposed to be kind of elected, but that doesn't necessarily happen in practice. They're mostly just nominated by people in the village, and then they become part of this council. They have certain responsibilities. One is to kind of conduct school council meetings, to kind of do a needs assessment of what the school necessarily may need. Then they have to utilize this budget that they're given every year, or like it's kind of transferred to them every quarter, but it's a non-salary budget, so they can't hire teachers from it, but they can hire temporary teachers, so they can do certain things with it. So one is they can hire temporary or contract teachers, or they can spend that money in infrastructural development, so providing drinking water or providing electricity to the school. Then they're tasked with certain other responsibilities, like improving enrollment, teacher and student attendance as part of their monitoring job. So like as you can see, they're tasked with lots of responsibilities. So the policy problem that I specifically addressed through this intervention is kind of the fact that in 2014, schools on average were only spending 33% of the funds that were available to them. And to put it another way, only 31% of the schools were kind of spending more than 75% of the budget that was available to them. So through conversations with the government and through people, it turned out that they may not have the information that they have the money or how to access it through bank accounts. And there was this fear of audit that if they spend that money, the government's going to come after them. So how did we kind of address it? The school council mobilization program happened where the government hired a call center, and they developed calling scripts. And the council members were called every month for 10 months from March to December. And the focus of those calls was kind of to inform them of the budget that they have, and then kind of expend from that budget. So there are certain program features that are worth mentioning that I think explain why the program may or may not have worked. So the program provided targeted information to school councils on the fact that they need to conduct certain meetings, the fact that they have money available in this particular fund, the process of spending the funds, and the fact that they can hire temporary teachers or improve school facilities. And these happened through the course of the 10 calls that they were given. The government kind of added credibility to the calls by telling the government that telling the council that this is a call directly made from the Punjab government, from the chief minister, so to kind of tell them that they don't need to fear spending out of that pool of money that they have. Then there was this continuous and personalized engagement with kind of the same calling agent to build trust with the council members. And then obviously there's some cultural nuances to it where the same-sex agents were kind of calling the council members. It was in the local language. And something that we tried to experiment with was conference calls, because not all members are equally active, and we kind of look at treatment as if a school was called at all, and not all members. So the conference call was to kind of make sure that all of the members were present when the call was made, so that there's some kind of engagement with all of them. And then it was low cost. It cost $50 per school for 10 months of engagement, which given the current kind of exchange rate is probably $30 now, as opposed to US $240 for a one-time in-person training. So there are kind of two things that I think are happening here. One could be this direct effect of information, because there's information on what and how it needs to be done, the spending of money, which could act as like an improvement in school resources within the education production and improve school and student outcomes. But then there is this indirect effect where you're kind of making a school council more autonomous, more informed, and more active, which would kind of lead to greater bottom-up accountability, and that would impact teacher behavior in certain ways. And also, like, there's recent evidence that talks about how even improving school resources on its own does not necessarily improve learning outcomes for students. There has to be something to do with how teachers are responding to these interventions. And then that could have a negative or adverse impact on student outcomes. So this is kind of the timeline and the data. The program was from March 2015 to December 2015. I look at school monitoring reports that are collected by monitoring and evaluation assistants every month. Then I look at census information, which is also collected every year. And then I look at some test scores data, which are also collected by the Punjab Examination Commission, which a lot of people in this room don't trust, but I do. So the school selection criteria, so there were 21 districts and 27,000 primary and middle schools. So the schools were kind of rank ordered in each district, school level and school gender kind of cell. And then those that were above the 50th percentile of enrollment were chosen for the program. However, treatment was inconsistent with the eligibility rule because numbers could not be traced for some of the councils. So it was, my paper has a whole discussion of why I don't use an RD design and why I prefer a diff and diff design. And obviously, if you're presenting to an economics audience, you get a lot of pushback on it, but I'm hoping that this audience will be more collegial. So I will present parallel trends. So this is like an estimation equation, a standard diff and diff estimation equation that I present. So here's some common trends. So I look at some of the outcomes that I'm looking at here, and there seems to be, so this is like a placebo diff and diff where there are no trends in pre-treatment outcome except for this expenditure variable. And in some specifications, I do control for trends in this outcome. And this is, again, me just proving that, please believe me. So what do I see here? I see that there is a positive impact on school council meetings. So they're meeting 0.21 times more in treated schools. And these I'm just comparing schools in an unbalanced versus a balanced panel. So those that were kind of monitored in every time period. And I look at the likelihood of spending money for treated schools is, at least 5.7 percentage time more. And I'm going to put this in context with baseline figures in just a second. And there is an increase of about 11,000 rupees, which is roughly equivalent to $100 in absolute terms in the money that they're spending every year. And just to put it in context, this is not a non-trivial amount. A contract teacher can be hired for as little as $15 a month in kind of the context that I'm working in, and a facility like a drinking water can be installed, or electricity can be installed in this context. So yes, they are spending money, and they are conducting more meetings, outcomes that are directly targeted through the program. But what happens on school outcomes? So there is no likelihood, like actually a 0.14 percentage points lower chance of hiring a contract teachers in treated schools. This factor of facilities, and I do test for multiple hypotheses, but I also create this factor of facilities where I'm looking at drinking water, electricity, all of these other factors, and there's a negative impact on that. Teacher attendance goes down by 0.59 percentage points. Student enrollment goes down by 2 students. Students present, there are 0.6 percentage points less students present in treated schools. It gets more depressing. So on outcomes, I look at math, Urdu, English test scores and a composite measure of these test scores. And they're actually going down by 1/10 of a standard deviation in treated schools. So just to quickly summarize what we know so far. So schools, they're conducting 2.5% more council meetings. They're 11% more likely to spend the money. And on average, they're spending 40% more money than non-SCMP schools. And then, like I said, it's a non-trivial amount for the context. Facilities are being reduced. The likelihood of hiring a contract teachers is going down. Student enrollment and teacher attendance is going down. And student test scores are going down. So I also look at whether or not the test scores are being, the reduction is kind of not being attenuated by reduced student enrollment or that more the students are taking the test. So that isn't even a problem. Only 9% of the reduction is kind of explained by that. So that kind of leaves me with 2 major questions that I'm trying to answer through my bigger dissertation work. So one is that where did the money go? So they spent on outcomes. It could be that they spent on outcomes that perhaps are not captured by the data. Or the fact that the outcomes that I'm looking at are perhaps not necessarily targeted or not impacted in the time frame that I'm looking at. But the second is what explains the negative impact on school and student outcomes. So one is that there could be this indirect effect where teachers kind of respond to this increased council presence and increased resources within the school, like the additional money that's kind of coming in. So there's no direct way to test it in the data that I have. I don't have measures of teacher effort. But so 2 ways that I could do it, that I do it and I explain in the paper, is that I compare primary and middle schools. So middle schools in Pakistan generally have teachers who have a greater political clout or influence within the community because of the duties that they have at the time of election, and they also kind of exert the same influence within the school. So I see that in middle schools, the school councils are kind of spending more money, but the student outcomes are actually adversely impacted. Like they're doing much worse in middle schools compared to primary schools. So there could be that, that's something that kind of explains teachers' resistance to the program. The second thing that I do is kind of look at, since I have post-intervention data for a lot of time periods, I'm able to kind of look at the dynamic effects of the program. So what happens once the program is actively engaged with council members versus once the program ends, or a year after the program. And I see that while the council is actively engaged, the council members are actually spending less money, and the outcomes are being more adversely impacted or more negatively impacted. So it could be that's one way to explain that there could be possible resistance. Oh, wait. Well, there should have been a regression table here that has the results, but now you'll just have to believe me. So just to kind of conclude and think about this particular intervention, that this was a very large-scale intervention which happened in 21 districts. So kind of problems that come with intervening in such a huge population, the fact that teachers could have actually worked together to actively resist the program. I mean, that's kind of one plausible thing that I think about. Then there's recent work that has emerged about how school-based management or local governance interventions may not work if there's no accountability through external exams. And Pakistan is not kind of taking, or Punjab necessarily isn't participating in any external exams. So that could be kind of one reason to explain what's happening. And lastly, we're here at this conference talking about systems in general. So I'm thinking the best way to sugarcoat it and not sound obnoxious, but I think that a lot of interventions like this kind of happen, are focused on optics, and the fact that this particular intervention was also focused on improving expenditure, improving school council meetings, and that happened. But the fact that it wasn't necessarily targeting students or student level outcomes, it kind of explains some of my results. Thank you. I think we're taking questions at the end.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for your attention today. I'm also going to be presenting on a school management initiative. So just to start off with, I want to recognize my partner in this work. So this is Elevate, an NGO working in primary education in Uganda. And also that this project is building on the results of a previous research project. And so I just wanted to recognize the members of that research team, a couple of whom are here at the conference this week. And so I just want to thank them for their support in this work. So just quickly outline the presentation today. I'm just very briefly going to describe school-based management, and then I'm going to describe the results of the original study. So this was an evaluation of a scorecard intervention and compared two different variations of the intervention and found that one was particularly effective. And so that's the starting point for the current study. So using that as a foundation to consider, well, why might this intervention be working, and how might we investigate its potential for sustainability and scale. So the qualitative study and process evaluation are still ongoing. They'll continue through this year. So this is a great point for feedback if anyone wants to talk at any point. And I'm just going to provide some preliminary findings from the impact assessment and discuss some early conclusions. So school-based management is generally understood in relation to decentralization, right? So the devolution of power and responsibility from a central level to a more local level. And so understanding how do we categorize school-based management interventions is often thought of in relation to what is being transferred and to whom is it being transferred. But many different education systems, such as Uganda, where we're working, have been decentralized for a long time. And so they're a mix of local authority and central management. But even in the context of a decentralized system, there are a number of different ways that we can think about school-based management. So whether that's community engagement, information campaigns, local accountability, and often this third reason is cited for the case of Uganda, where there are relatively high rates of teacher absenteeism, right? So we see it's in our baseline, 25% of teachers were not on the school compound at the time of our visit. But generally, school-based management includes a lot of different interventions, a lot of different initiatives. There's a very mixed bag of results, and so we're trying to unpack what's going on. So the original study, like I said before, was a scorecard intervention. So scorecards have been used in Uganda in health, in politics, and in this case, it's training local actors to monitor issues at the school, to create a scorecard based upon that monitoring, and then to disseminate the results of that scorecard to various stakeholders. It's important to note that although this is a community intervention, that stipulated who can be on the scorecard. So there are 3 parents, 3 members of the pre-existing school management committee, 3 teachers, head teachers, and a pupil representative. And so this study looked at 2 different variations of this treatment. So there was a participatory version in which at the same community meeting where participants elected who would be on the scorecard committee, they also elected what they wanted to be on the scorecard. So the issues and then the indicators they had used to monitor it. And then in the standard version, the research team and government partners determined, okay, what might the best scorecard look like? What issues could we include on it? So everything about these 2 interventions is the same, except how the content of the scorecard was determined. So the results of the evaluation find that the participatory scorecard improved student-teacher attendance, it improved test scores. The standard scorecard had statistically insignificant results. So this is a really great starting point to consider why might one variation of the same intervention be working, and how do we unpack these results and think about it. So an interesting starting point is to consider, well, what are these schools monitoring, right? So each school in the participatory treatment, would be monitoring something different. But so here we have the frequency at which different issues were included on scorecards. So in the standard scorecard, everybody's monitoring the same thing, and the research team provides information on how satisfied schools were with what they were monitoring, the issues that they were looking at. So generally, there's some alignment between these 2 different approaches. So those issues that are most frequently included in a participatory scorecards are those issues that schools in the standard scorecard are least satisfied with. But I think one of the most interesting things about the results is that the issues that schools are monitoring are not those issues for which there are effects. All right, so all standard schools are monitoring teacher attendance and pupil attendance, and there aren't really any effects. The participatory schools, the majority of them are not monitoring teacher attendance, the majority of them are not monitoring student attendance, and yet there are effects. So here's a pretty standard theory of change. This is from a review of community accountability interventions in education. And the results of this intervention seem to suggest that there's some disconnect, right? If the issues that we're monitoring are not those issues for which we're experiencing effects, what's happening here? Where's the breakdown in our understanding of the mechanisms behind this intervention? So the research team luckily was testing some alternative hypotheses or other ways to understand. So they conducted behavioral games, or a voluntary contributions mechanism game, with all members of the scorecard committee. So this is intended to measure willingness to invest in the public good or collective action. So here we see S is standard and P is participatory. So this is comparing these 2 different approaches to the scorecard, members of the scorecard committee. See that committee members, scorecard committee members in the participatory treatment are more likely to invest in the public good. And so the researchers use this as a way in which to hypothesize so that the participatory approach is better engaging these committee members in the discussion about the challenges at the school. But so how does it relate to what they're monitoring, right? What might these discussions be about? So just returning to the issues that the participatory schools are monitoring, 90% of schools are looking at staff housing and support. It's often referred to as teacher accommodation, right? So in Uganda and many other countries, there's a simple barrack structure on the school compound so teachers don't have to commute. So why might they be monitoring this? Why this is important? So during this study period, there were multiple nationwide teacher strikes in Uganda, right? So the government failed to deliver upon a promised salary increase. So how do we understand what are the local accountability relationships? What's happening in these schools? Because an important point is staff housing and support actually didn't change, right? So this is a 2-year study. A lot of schools didn't create an entire new structure. Why did monitoring it result in these effects? All right, so this is the starting point for the current study. Right, to think about, okay, how can we better understand what's happening here? The results of this original study suggest that this might be one of the most cost-effective interventions for improving primary education in Uganda. But if we want to think about moving towards sustainability and scale, what can we better understand about this intervention? And so we have a number of different motivating questions coming from the previous research, right? So how's this intervention interacting with Ugandan context? What other issues are influencing the scorecard? How can we better understand the underlying mechanisms of the scorecard? And because the research team was really gracious and shared the same program implementation manuals, we're trying to implement the same intervention, will it result in the same educational outcomes? So Elevate, the organization, is implementing just the participatory scorecard. So these 3 motivating questions generally translate to the 3 components of our study. So just some basic information. The original study was conducted in 4 districts across Uganda. Elevate is implementing the studies being conducted only in Mukono. And so this is through a partnership with the district education officer of Mukono, who's a really important collaborator in this work, is very supportive. And this is also because Elevate's interested in moving away from implementing just on an individual school level and thinking about if there's a move to scale, how do we consider implementing at the level of the sub-county? So treatment assignment is ultimately at the level of sub-county. And an important research question in the process evaluation related to this is who is implementing this intervention? And so in the original study, NGO partners trained central coordinating tutors. And so these are general support positions in Ugandan primary education. They're networked through the teachers training colleges. But like community health workers, like a lot of other government workers, there's concern about overburdening this workforce or whether they're actually fulfilling their original mandate. So not in the study region for this project, but in the same district, different sub-counties, Elevate's looking at the activity of CCTs. So here we have the pink bars showing how many schools CCTs are supposed to be visiting, and the blue bars are showing how many schools CCTs are actually visiting. So because of discrepancy, because there's concern that NGOs want to turn to government workers, but these might be just moving between project to project, we're looking at working with a profile of a different person to be conducting the initial community meeting at schools. But unfortunately, that kind of determined where we could work. The availability of these different positions. But so Mukono has 13 different sub-counties, and the study is in 6. So we created 3 matched pairs of sub-counties to be able to do treatment assignment at the sub-county level. In one of them, we were able to randomize which sub-county received the treatment. In the 2 others, it was determined based upon the availability of the workforce. So it's not a full randomized control trial. It's a quasi-experimental. But in spite of that, we were pretty happy with the balance statistics we saw both across school and the pupils. So to start with the qualitative study, we're ultimately planning to conduct about 60 qualitative interviews. At this point, we have 37. And we're focused on 2 stakeholders, so parents and teachers. And we're looking in both treatment and control. So in control schools, we're just generally trying to understand how people perceive and think about these different roles and responsibilities in primary education. And one of the reasons we're focusing on parents is that they're often seen as the beneficiary or the client in educational interventions. They're seen to be a really important part of local accountability interventions. But in Uganda, there's also this really strong narrative of blaming parents. Right? So here we have a quote from a school inspector saying, what's the primary challenge facing education in Mukono? Parents' attitudes. And so we really wanted to interrogate this narrative. Is this just, an easy scapegoat to say parents are the problem in primary education, or what's really happening there? And so we're doing a lot of intensive interviewing surrounding this, and also, we recognize teachers are a really important stakeholders. So having those 2 focuses. So the process evaluation, like I said before, we're looking at the role of the facilitator, their identity, what kind of activities they do, but then just generally we're trying to identify and document all the incremental steps, so we can potentially, detail a good theory of change, propose potential causal pathways, and really trying to unpack what's happening here. And so we have a number of different ways in which we're doing this. But just to start, so here are the issues that schools are choosing to monitor in the participatory scorecard. The top 7 all relate to parents. Right? So this is really aligning that this initiative, people are electing, parents are also electing themselves. They're focusing on the role of parents as this issue in primary education. So for the impact assessment, we have a number of different data sources. So we have an individually tracked pupil sample, a head teacher survey, the attendance spot check, random spot check, and then we conducted the same behavioral game that was used in the original study. So this was conducted over 2 years, just as in the original study, between baseline and end line. So we don't see any impact on teacher attendance, but generally attendance improved over this time period. Right, so the district education officer really took this on as an initiative, and so he was working with the school inspectors and the head teachers to try and improve teacher attendance during this time period, and it improved. So it's really exciting. It just didn't have anything to do with our intervention. We also have no impact on pupil attendance, but we do see a decrease in dropout rates. So remember, during a 2-year time period, overall, about 8% of the sample dropped out of school. This is starting in the sort of end of grade 2, beginning of grade 3. Compared to other research I've done in this region in Uganda, this is a pretty comparable dropout rate. So this is a multi-level mixed effects logistic regression. So this is predicting the probability of dropping out of school, accounting for the 3 different levels of our data. These are odds ratios. It's less than 1, so kids in the treatment seem less likely to have dropped out of school. We also see an impact upon transfer. So this is a very densely populated region of Uganda. There are lots of schools and there's lots of movement between them. Right? So here we see in 2 years, almost 20% of the sample has changed to a different school. And we see, again, odds ratio less than 1. Kids in the treatment school seem slightly less likely to transfer. We also see this reflected in the head teacher survey. So head teachers reporting on average 6 fewer transfers during this time period. So the original study used Uganda's NAPE exam, so the National Assessment of Education Progress. The administration of this exam perfectly aligns with our time period, so we will also be using these data, but they haven't released it yet. So we're in conversation with Uganda's National Examinations Board, and we hope to gain access to these data. But in the meantime, in our individually tracked pupil sample, we administered the UASO tool. Right? So this is individual one-on-one assessment, basic learning, basic literacy and numeracy. We see no impact when we look at the UASO scores as a 0 or 5 score. But it's possible that the UASO instrument isn't necessarily a linear instrument. So when we break it down by level, we don't really see anything except for this last level, right? So this is what is often referred to in UASO instruments as the bonus questions. So it's if a child can read a paragraph correctly and then answer 2 questions about the content of that paragraph. You actually see fewer children in our treatment are reaching this final level. So then when we dichotomize, okay, so this is a dichotomize whether or not a child reaches this final level of reading comprehension, we actually see a negative impact. So children in the treatment schools are less likely to reach this final level. We see a similar trend in math, but generally kids are doing a lot better in math, right? So here we have, almost 60% of kids are at proficiency for math. In reading, it's less than 40. But nothing's statistically significant for math. We don't really see anything happening there. But so one possible hypothesis is that this might be related to transfer into private school. So remember, really high rates of transfer. Just over half of kids that are transferring into the private sector. We see higher rates in the treatment sample. So when we look at it, we do see sort of a decrease in transfer. And when you break it down by school type, so this is excluding those children who have dropped out of school, right? So the original sample is all randomly selected from the population of kids in government schools. 2 years later, we have percent of them transferring to private schools. Nothing seems to be happening in the early levels of the UASO instrument, but here, for those kids who are transferring into a school, they seem to be reaching this higher level. So maybe something's happening in private schools where there's more individualized attention, or something's happening for kids at the high level of the spectrum who are able to reach that final level. So just to quickly test this, I include transfer into private schools as a covariate, predicting whether or not a child reaches that level of comprehension. And I do very basic instrumental variables analysis. So this is not conclusive. This is just exclusion restriction, number of things associated with instrumental variables might not be met, but it seems to suggest that this might be an explanation for that negative impact that we see. But it's really important to recognize this is a relatively small phenomenon, right? So only about 2.5% of kids of the total sample are those that are in the private sector and getting that higher level, and 75% of children in the private school aren't reaching that high level of comprehension. And other research I have on this area of Uganda, other areas of Uganda, the private sector isn't necessarily outperforming the public sector across all levels on the UASO instrument. So it must be something about this transfer, right? So which parent is looking for an alternative and what's happening there. So I have some other research on that if people are interested. And then, so I'm out of time, but we played the behavioral game. There are a number of key differences between our administration of the game and the original studies. We use the same protocol, same number of players, same amount of money, but we didn't have a peer comparison because our control group didn't have a scorecard committee, so we had to approximate the members of the scorecard committee in the control group. And the original study played the game at the very beginning of the intervention, so after the initial training, whereas we played it at the end, more like an outcome. So we see generally similar levels of investment in the school count, this willingness to invest in the public good. But the only impact we see is for teachers. So that's a summary and then some preliminary conclusions. I'd be happy to talk about it later because we're out of time. Thank you so much.
Is that better? Is that better? All right. shall we? Okay, so if you look at the IO literature and you look at how people think about firms, the way we usually think about understanding firms and the market and the industry is we think about a government policy, and then we say, how do we track this policy out in terms of a change in industry productivity? That's really the game behind thinking about industries, right? So if you look at, for example, the work by D. Locker and Penny Goldberg and Amit Khandelwal, they're looking at trade liberalization in India. What did this do to markups? What did this do to profits? How did industry productivity change, right? That's been really hard to do in education, right? And the idea, the reason behind this is the way we want to think about this is there's a policy change, right? As a result of that policy change, there's a school response, right? And then finally, because of that school response, there's a short term, but then there's a medium term or longer term response where the schools start innovating and there's a change in the production technology, right? What's quite surprising is how little progress we have made with this. The fundamental problem here has been whenever we make a big policy change, test scores and quality are determined both by what the school is doing and what the household is doing and how the children are sorting across schools. And it's been almost impossible to make clean statements that the schools responded and therefore test score changed in response to the policy. Now, we have made progress here. So Chris Nielsen has a great paper from Chile showing a specific policy change in the pricing of vouchers and how schools responded to that. And we have two papers, I'll show you what methodology we are trying to use, that look precisely at what we call simulated institutional changes. That is, we simulate a large government intervention while managing it all ourselves and try and track out, okay, how did this policy change translate into industry changes, right? This is a big question mark. As of now, we don't have a single piece of work from the education field that tracks a policy change into innovation and experimentation in schools, right? So what am I going to try and, so our project has been the following, which is we work in villages that we call closed markets, which is everybody in this village is going to schools in the villages, and all the schools are taking their children are coming from within the village. And the reason that happens is because these villages are fairly well marked in terms of having a cluster of households and a field around it with people not going outside, right? What we then do is we have control villages where things evolve as usual, right? And we have treatment villages where we shock with the new policy change, right? And then we let things evolve as they will. Let schools shut down, let schools reallocate, let children move wherever they want to, right? And re-examine the equilibrium some years later. Okay? What we don't do is impose any restriction on how these schools may react. They can react in test scores, the private schools can react in prices, there can be enrollment changes, there can be household changes. We don't put a lot of prior on where we expect those changes to be. We measure them, right? So two precursors to this paper, and I think what I'm going to do is try and get through the preview fairly carefully and then run through the results. So it's more a trust but verify exercise. First precursor is our paper on report cards, which is 2017. And in that paper, what we did was we tested children in grade 3 and we provide report cards. Again, remember there are these two types of villages and we're doing it in these treatment villages. The report card shows child test scores in these subjects, as well as test scores of the mean child in the school and the mean child in the village. And the back of the report card shows all schools in the village and their test scores. So this is what the front of the card looks like. That is Urdu, Angrezi, and math. And that's your child, that's the average child in your school, and that's the average child in your village. And that's the back of the report card, right? Which lists out all schools, how many children were tested, and the test scores of these kids, right? What we find is the following. We find that prices decline for private schools. We find that test scores increase in all kinds of schools. We find that more children are enrolled in school, and we find some evidence that children left bad private schools and went to good private schools, right? The second precursor is a paper that's forthcoming now with Natalie Pao, and there we look at teacher value added in the LEAPS project. So this is looking at what happens in how teachers react. And three things that I want you to keep in mind. One is teachers are very important for student learning. Moving a student from a teacher in the 5th to the 95th percentile increases test scores by about 0.5 standard deviations. The second one is observed teacher characteristics account for less than 5% of the variation in TVA. And the third, and this is something that Dion and Tessa and others are finding in Africa as well, is that test scores are strongly correlated with higher TVA. Right? So I want to give you a benchmark. 1 standard deviation higher teacher test scores are associated with a 0.29 to 0.33 higher standard deviation higher TVA, or a 0.05 to 0.06 higher SD standard deviations in child test scores. Right? Okay, with that, you have to have photographs. So we've been tracking these kids for a while. I went to this household, and this guy had this photograph up. This is the girl who came first in our tests, and they had, they had the report card and they had framed the photograph. This is 16 years later. And the second photograph is me in the field when I started this project. It's been a while, but we're getting there, right? Okay. So with that, you don't really want to see my face when I was, okay. So what's the new work? The new work is the following. We're going to re-examine this information intervention 8 years after we did it, right? This entire cohort of children is going to be new, right? So think about kindergarten in 2003. These kids have all passed out of these primary schools. These are all new children, right? There's going to be substantial entry and exit of schools that could allow for a broader range of effects to kick in. So there were 820 schools in 2003. 57% of schools were still open in 2011 of these. 20% open in 2003 but shut later, and 20% open after 2003. So in some ways, there's going to be room for creative destruction in this game, right? What's the timeline? Well, 2003, we're going to do a baseline. Then we're going to distribute the report cards. 2004, 2005, this is where we published the first paper. And then we do a very light report card distribution where we just give these report cards to all villages, but only in the schools, and they stayed in the schools. So as far as we know, those results never got disseminated wider. We do one round there, and then we come back 5 years later, and I'm going to talk about this round and what happened. Okay? So what's the preview? And the rest I'll run through. Right? The first is that these improvements in test scores are going to be maintained. So we're going to see larger, so we're going to see about 0.01, 0.1 standard deviation increases in test scores, and they're going to be much larger, but not significantly so in private schools. We're going to see that the price declines in the private schools are maintained, right? In addition, there's going to be no churning and differences in private shares, no change in observed characteristics of children and parents by whether they were in public or private schools. And number 1 and 2 are going to imply large improvements in market productivity. So this is going to be our first example of an intervention that significantly increased market productivity or industry productivity over a long horizon, right? You've got an increase in test scores and a decline in prices. Where is this going to come from? Why is it that 2 doses of information are going to create a long-run effect? Well, it's got to be that you had a stock that didn't depreciate, right? Now, there are 2 options for that stock. One way to think about that stock is as physical infrastructure. Maybe these schools constructed classrooms and buildings at that point, and what we are seeing is the non-depreciated part of that hanging out, right? The other way to think about it is, what does information do? Information gives you knowledge. And what's special about knowledge? It's non-rival, and it doesn't depreciate. So if they learned something fundamental from our doing this, then we should see that those effects persist over the long run, right? So what do we find? We're going to show you the following channels. The reason why these private schools are able to survive is because they decrease their costs significantly. In fact, they decrease their costs more than their prices, so their profits actually went up. right? So they moved to a new production technology. What was that new production technology? It had two parts. They were relying more on family labor, but in addition, they increased their class sizes and improved the quality of their teachers. So they fundamentally changed the way they were doing stuff, right? So 4 minutes remaining. I'm not going to tell you a lot more. There's one thing. These are all fairly simple reduced form estimates. One thing I should point out, right? Whatever theory we write, the school chooses a quality level, and then children come to the school. So we always provide two estimates. One is an unweighted school quality estimate, which is what is relevant for the theory. But then children are going to come to those schools, and what really matters for welfare is a weighted estimate at the level of the child, right? So we're going to give you those two. Here are the numbers. This is the school level. We've got a 0.15 standard deviation increase 8 years later. Here's the child level. It's 0.07403. The difference is actually not significant. Here are the school results in terms of fees. 22% decline in fees, which is about 528 rupees. You can do cost effectiveness. This turns out to be the single most cost effective thing you can do just in terms of test score improvements. Once you factor in the price changes, we saved these households 4 million rupees over these 8 years, right? So this is not a trivial, the intervention is fully paid for. There is zero cost to it once you factor in the decline in private spending, all of that kind of stuff, right? Here's the results on public versus private schools. So the private schools gained 0.26 standard deviations, the public 0.12, right? And here's the main weighted productivity increases come from. It's not coming from Schumpeterian creative destruction. We are not seeing differences in exit entry. We are not seeing differences in reallocation of students to better schools, right? So this is entirely coming from higher TFP among existing schools, right? What is that story? Well, two parts. One is the cost of schooling is coming down. In public, it's not moving at all. But in private, it's come down about 750 rupees, right? And remember, their fees came down 550, so they're actually bumping up their profits by about 200. And you see this very clearly in the distribution. So you see this this is the total private distribution. These are the teacher costs, and these are the running costs. It came down in both. And then where did they save on cost? They increased their class sizes. On average, a private school cut down its teaching workforce from 8.5 to 7 teachers. They eliminated bonuses for teachers, and they reduced wages a little bit, more reliance on family labor. No change in a bunch of things, no change in a bunch of things. Where did the test score improvements come from? The teachers are now far more knowledgeable in the treated villages than in the control villages. And a couple of things to point out here. One is, this is with the public and the private. So this is the private result, which shows that teachers are 0.4 standard deviations higher test scores in treated compared to control villages. And remember, again, this is the only thing that matters in the paper with Natalie is teacher test scores, right? The second thing, which I find really heartening and which Caroline Hawksby has been saying for a while, is public schools are responsive. So look, the public school interaction is actually really small and insignificant. So somehow, the public schools also managed to react to this intervention by improving the quality of the teachers who were there, right? What specifically did they do? So here what we're trying to do is we're looking at all the teachers in 2011 by when they were hired, right? So what does 2003 mean? 2003 means in the control group, there are 114 teachers in 2011 who were tested, who were first hired in 2003 or before, right? And now there's a significant difference, which means that in the treated schools, they retained the teachers who had a higher test score relative to the control schools, right? These, on the other hand, are teachers who were hired between 2006 and 11, and across the board, these numbers are tiny, but across the board, what you see is they were able to retain or hire teachers who were higher test scores, right, as a result of this intervention, right? So let me conclude. I'm over time by 27 seconds. So first of all, so 2 doses of information had long-term impact, probably by changing the production technology. So this is really, I mean, for me, this is the first paper where I'm, fairly clear now that the way forward is to think about market level interventions, not specific, in addition to specific school interventions, right? I mean, these interventions really have enormous power. Private schools move towards fewer but higher quality teachers, allowing them to reduce costs and increase test scores. Public schools also manage to obtain and retain higher quality teachers. The effects are smaller and in line with somewhat smaller test score effects. There is no change in quantities, right? So all the movements are coming from TFP changes among existing firms, no changes in quantity, no changes in market shares across type of schools, initial productivity, whatever we want to think about. And it's also surprising for us that government schools now have higher quality teachers. So I think we need to start rethinking whether these competitive effects, government schools are somehow able to manage these things in a way that this competition actually does play out, right? So the overall results are consistent with information playing 2 roles. It increases the incentives for test scores and cost cutting. But the other thing I think which we underappreciated in our original paper is because we had that listing of all these schools, when we have gone back and started talking to these head teachers, they're saying that really helped them understand what it is about the school that matters, right? I mean, in these focus groups, I still remember our teachers saying, oh, that's really weird. That school has really good infrastructure, but you're saying they have terrible test scores. So it must be something else that's going on. And I think it's that production of knowledge that really does not decay. So let me stop there, and apologies for going over time.
Okay, we have about 20 minutes for questions, so I'm going to do exactly as Justin did and take in rounds of 3. So I saw a lightning hand quick, one there, and one there, and then I'll move on to that part of the room. So.
Hi. So first, I had a question for Jishnu, which is, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how much autonomy schools have in terms of like hiring and firing teachers, because it seems like this effect through, happens through hiring higher quality teachers, and it obviously would only work in a context where schools have a lot of decision-making power. And then I just had one other comment about the other Pakistan paper. I wonder, just coming up with hypotheses in terms of your results. I wonder if you're seeing lower test scores. Maybe like, is cheating an issue in this context? Like maybe there's more scrutiny, and then teachers are responding to cracking down on cheating more, and you're seeing a lower test score result because of through a cheating mechanism.
Could you perhaps say who you are before asking your question? I knew who you were, Amanda Beatty. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, Steve Cleese, University of Maryland. A general question that applies to the last 3 presentations and also to RISE generally, so Clare might want to weigh in. We're basing all of these studies on test scores, on a narrow definition of learning. Schools are multidimensional, has multidimensional products. Socio-emotional learning is important. The SDG target 4.7 is about broader dimensions of learning. And so I'm concerned, and wonder if you're concerned about, we're making suboptimal recommendations in the sense that things that may affect cognitive test scores may affect other outcomes negatively. There was a recent study, I think it was on school management in Peru, that showed a rise in test scores, but a negative effect on attitudinal and other variables. And so I'd like comments on that.
Right at the back.
Comments on the last three studies, but the one which was on school councils, I wonder if we are looking into the vertical, even though it is a devolved setup after 2010, all provinces have full authority to implement and execute education systems, but there's a verticality between the province and the local government level. So decision making is very centralized, and so there's very little space on what school councils can really do. The story of the call centers, where the government is trying to look good to show spend, but not necessarily where you have evidence of decision making. So I wondered, how much control school councils had, or how much agency they had on the improvements. The second comment I had on Jishnu's, as you know, I don't know if you've been looking at a pretty steady state of prevalence of private sector. We haven't seen really any great enhancement in the prevalence of private sector, because again, the stories from Punjab, a lot of interventions of the government have gone into schools, and under our ASR work, we see, in fact, the gaps closing between public and private sector over the past few years. So, I mean, you haven't spoken much about the public sector, and I'm just wondering what's happening over there, as you did mention, that in fact you see better qualified teachers and maybe better teachers being hired, but there's a lot more going on in the public sector, and hence the cost-cutting actions by the private sector. So I think the dynamics of the two are perhaps underexplained.
Okay, let's take those in order. Amanda, autonomy. A question from Amanda to Jishnu on autonomy.
So on the cheating, no, that's not what's going on, because we do the tests ourselves.
Oh no, I just was saying, I was talking about cheating in the other study, not your study.
Autonomy.
I don't believe there's any cheating on Elite's study.
Okay.
Teacher hiring and firing.
Yeah, no, so I think the right response is, as a community, we don't know how government schools respond. I think we have been too sanguine about thinking, myself included, that government schools have very limited autonomy. I think at the same point, what we're discovering is, as we're doing this test, that there's massive variation in test scores and value added across government schools, and we don't have a theory for it. I think what does happen is these teachers are part and parcel of the community, and when these test scores started coming out, they started making life hard for some of these teachers, who then demanded transfers out, right? So it's not totally clear to me that there isn't that level of decision making and autonomy, and I think we should think pretty seriously about what's creating variation in value added across government schools. I mean, we don't have a good idea.
My point was that at least you showed churn, right? You see new teachers like coming in, which could
Over an 8-year period, yeah, sure.
So the question on cheating was directed at you, Minahil. Do you want to?
Sure. Actually, before I can take that question, can I just say that this iPad makes me so anxious, because it just, like, the time keeps going and it turns red, and then you're just like, oh my God. Anyway, on cheating, like, honestly, I haven't, Amanda, thought about it, but I cannot compare the Punjab Examination Commission examinations to the LEAP study. There definitely could be cheating, but the fact that teachers are responding to it in a certain way, I don't necessarily know, because these are board examinations that don't happen in the school. They kind of happen in different schools, so your own teachers may not necessarily be supervising these tests, but that's something that I can definitely look into. And as I'm talking, can I respond to both the other questions. So I think it's a great point about looking at broader dimensions of learning. I'm sorry, I lost where the gentleman is.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm using administrative data, and I don't know of data sets that exist in Pakistan that actually capture socio-emotional learning and other aspects of it. But you're right. I think that's something that's incredibly important and kind of needs to be looked at when evaluating any program. And the last question from the back about autonomy and agency. So you're right. I think since the 18th Amendment, there has been decentralization, but it's still centralized at the provincial level. But the fact that I would say school councils since 2014 have agency and autonomy primarily because of this non-salary budget that they're kind of given. I can only speak through what the data has told me and the conversations that I've had with council members. And since the head teacher is part of the council, and since there are certain members of the community who hold certain influence part of that council, at least from the conversations I have had and what the data is showing, they have considerable autonomy. They may not have the information to kind of execute things that they need to do, but in terms of autonomy, I would argue otherwise.
Jishnu, do you want to follow up on the specific question from the back on the dynamics between the public and private sector, and then we'll have a general reflection on other dimensions of measuring learning?
I mean, there's an enormous amount of going on in Pakistan. So Zainab, who's sitting here, along with others, have done some fantastic work mapping out the 110 reforms that Pakistan has carried out over the last 18, 19 years. I think the advantage of kind of trying to do what we were doing is because we maintain this randomized control and treatment, you could argue that whatever changes that were going on that were secular changes over this horizon are taken care of by the experimental methods, right?
Do anyone else, Michelle, maybe this is also for you as well, since you were talking about learning profiles primarily measured through test scores, want to reflect on capturing other dimensions that we might be impacting beyond just test scores?
I'm happy to talk a little bit. So, we reported UASO scores, I think, because that, really resonates with the discussion happening in Uganda around these very basic learning outcomes. And that's something we hear a lot from parents, especially in relation to the growing private sector, this concern that children are going to school and they can't read. So I think it's important, not only in considering tests, but even when working within test scores, to consider outcomes that are immediately salient and understandable and of priority to the population that you're working with. But then also it's interesting, looking at what schools are monitoring. So this is a community level initiative identifying what are the challenges in the school, and almost no schools are monitoring test scores. Right? And so there's this whole host of other sort of school level outcomes, and so related to attendance and dropout and a number of these other concerns. And then just in relation to the social emotional learning, I'm working on a couple other projects about creating measures for social emotional learning, and just how early in the process we are with that, and just caution around thinking about developing measures that are appropriate for any individual context. So something that we see come up a few times in Uganda is issues around discipline and corporal punishment. But that's a hugely contested topic that there isn't really any resolution on. So I think there is a lot of really important work being done around social emotional learning, but that it's still very early stages. And so I think it's exciting to think about, but just to consider within this broader context of what parents want, what makes sense within any particular context, and thinking about developing really good high quality measures.
Can I make one?
Yeah,
Sorry.
sure.
Sorry, go ahead, Michelle.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, all kind of in agreement, but also just two thoughts. But one is obviously we're constrained by the data that we have. So if we have data on literacy and numeracy, that's what we can study, and we don't have data on a lot of these other things. But to the point where we don't even have good test score data in any kind of comprehensive way for a lot of these countries. These are specific examples of places where we could design as a test or administer something or have some kind of source of learning outcomes. Some of the work I've done with DHS data, that the first learning profiles that I showed that came from related work, a one-sentence literacy exam is kind of the only real measure of learning we have in some of those countries that we have DHS, where we're asking someone to read one sentence and gauging whether they're literate based on that. So I think just like kind of the dearth of data that we have on some of these learning areas is is very real. And then the other thing too is if we have such low literacy rates in some places, like in some of those countries, only 10% can even read that one sentence. So there is kind of the prioritization where we probably need to get at least some of those basic skills in place. And then, I mean, it's both chicken and egg. I mean, you don't want to just leave it totally behind, but recognizing that those basic skills are really important. And if we're not getting those, like the chances of being able to get some of the more higher order things right is just really limited.
Just one more point on the socio-emotional skills. I can't stress how important it is that these things are measured well. And I think we have two problems. I mean, Alice Denon has been looking at this pretty carefully. And both the work that Karen McClure's and that she's doing show that none of the factor structure things that work in the US work in these other papers that are being published using this in low-income countries. So the first problem is we don't know how to measure it well. And we haven't spent either the resources or the time to figure out how these measures should be constructed in low-income countries. The second problem we have is at the country level, everybody looks like West Point cadets with massive grade, right? So remember, there is no country gradient in socio-emotional skills. So we have a serious problem, which is we find variation within communities, but we don't find variation across large groups, right? So how do we say, we can say, well, the US has much higher numeracy and literacy than India, but they have the same grade, right? And how to deal with that is a huge problem, right? I mean, the macro is not going to work on that. So I think that's very much a starting point. We're at the starting of how to measure that and how to get it done. I think we're nowhere close to saying, let's do it.
Okay, let's take, I think we've got time for one more round of questions. So one question here. Peter, I'm not going to let you have the floor because you will have a chance later. You've already asked a question. I'm trying to be, equality is important. There, and Noreen, you also had your hand up. Okay, so there's three.
Hi, thank you very much for this one. Can you hear me? My name is Megan Mahoney. I'm from Educate. Thank you for those wonderful presentations. We're working a lot with thinking about how to help schools manage to outcomes like curriculum adherence and then thinking about teacher pedagogy and school performance. So one thing that stood out to me about a theme across the three is, not shockingly, the information you provide and who you provide it to seems to impact the results quite significantly. And in the final example in Pakistan, it seemed like schools were getting a lot of information about how students were doing, and they were able to manage to that outcome. So my question is for the school committee example in Pakistan and in Uganda, how much information did schools have about how students were doing? You mentioned that you all were collecting monitoring reports periodically. Did they get that information? And in the case of Uganda, how much information were they opting to collect about not only how students were performing, but what was happening in the classroom? And do you think if that shifted, we would have seen any different results? Thank you.
Actually, seeing as Noreen's right there, go Noreen.
Hi, Noreen Karachiwala from IFPRI. A quick thought for Minahil. One sort of thing you may be able to look at in terms of these decreases in teacher attendance, engagement, and test scores is, were teachers being pulled out of the classroom and away from students to participate more in the school councils? And you may be able to check these data in some ways. If you have specific data on which teachers were in the school councils, were those the ones who were spending less time or more likely to be away? Are more teachers likely to be involved in the school councils, in middle schools, things like that?
Thank
you. I am Julián Cristia from the Research Department of the Inter-American Development Bank. I have two questions, one for Jishnu. I was really surprised about this lack of fade-out effects. We see that in so many interventions there are fade-outs very strong, and in fact knowledge depreciates a lot. Like you learn a number of words now, in 1 year you're going to forget 80%, and we see that in so many interventions. So if you can tell us a little bit more about the fade-out, if it was a surprise for you, or what do you think about that? And the second question is, this program seems really cost-effective, amazingly cost-effective. And we do a lot of research thinking about then disseminate, scale up, implement. Can you tell about scale up in other countries or in Pakistan? Yes.
Okay, let's take the question from Educate about how much information was provided in the two school-based management interventions. Do you want to start?
So the way in which the scorecard works is that the committee collects data throughout the year. They reconcile, so each individual member works to create a general committee scorecard, and then they disseminate it upwards to the district education office and lower in parent meetings. But one thing I think that's really interesting in this area related to the information that's reaching parents is in a lot of our qualitative interviews, parents sort of talk about being at a loss of how to choose schools. And so again, this is in a very densely populated part of Uganda. There are very many schools. It's a growing private sector. So actually in this region, in Uganda, more kids are attending, so about 60% of kids are attending private schools. But there are extremely high rates of transfer, and families have kids attending multiple schools. So you have an average family with 6 or 7 children, and they'll be attending 2 or 3 different schools. And so it's not only, sort of what information is there, but how parents make decisions and how they consider, I think another important consideration about these school-based management interventions is that they're a relatively distal intervention between ultimately getting to learning outcomes. And so beyond recognizing whether a teacher is in a classroom or not, what can parents evaluate about teaching styles or pedagogy or curriculum or anything along those lines? And then how do they make decisions? And in some cases, parents are talking about experimenting. But I think it's also important, there's some really interesting research by Sharon Wolf and colleagues in Ghana where including parent interventions actually had a negative impact upon how schools were doing. And it was related to the emphasis upon play and parents wanting stricter. We see this in relation to mother tongue or what parents want might diverge from what's happening at a school. So I definitely think there's a lot of work to be done there. And then just a final point is that in a lot of these management interventions, there's a cohort of parents that regularly attend school. And then there's a cohort of parents that doesn't. And a lot of these interventions only reach the people that might already be on the PTA or might already be on the school management committee. And I think there's a lot more effort required. 50% of Ugandan children still aren't completing primary school. And on any given day, 25% of kids are absent. And so the chronic absenteeism students, those children who are dropping out early, I don't think we have a lot of interventions that are reaching those parents who might not already be engaged in the schooling system. So I think that's what we're kind of seeing in what schools are working on in relation to getting parents. These are those parents that are already pretty invested, and they're saying, we need to reach out and get to these families that aren't being engaged in the interventions that we have right now.
So we are running short on time. So if you could give us just 1 or 2 sentences on the amount of information that was in your intervention.
So no information on school performance was given, but I have a longer answer that I can give later.
Jishnu, lack of fade out, and was this a surprise?
So I think you have to be careful how you define fade outs. Fade out, the way people have usually defined is I treat individual A. What's the impact on individual A 3 years later, right? We're not talking about that. We're talking about I've treated the village for an entirely new cohort of children, right? What's the impact on the treatment? So I don't know how to compare. We can do the fade out results. We'll probably find similar things. But this is talking about changes in productivity at the schooling level, right? So I wouldn't compare it directly to the fade out. You also asked about scale up and cost effectiveness. Yeah, it's cost effective. We should scale it up. There's a group doing it in India. I think there's a lot of information in Latin American places. I think the big problem has been that schools and households don't know how to interpret it. Because the big advantage here was because we were in these informationally dense villages, you could actually compare across schools. And it's amazing how much information the schools have about each other in terms of the inputs. So anytime you sit with the school, the major concern is, oh man, that guy put in a new water cooler, I'm screwed, all the kids are going to go there now, right? They know about the inputs. It was the fact that we gave them the outcomes that allowed them to then do a regression, right? And that's, I think, the key thing that we're trying to get at over here.
And just to finish, Noreen's suggestion to you on the school councils. Do you want to offer a reflection?
So teachers aren't on the school council, only the head teacher is, but it's a good point. I can definitely look at how much time a head teacher is kind of putting into the school council and how that affects their presence within the classroom. I think that's something I can think about.
Okay, I'm going to sum up the 3 papers on the demand side briefly, and then offer what I took as the key takeaway from your talk. So the title of the session was demand side. And I think what comes out really clearly here is that we need to think about demand and supply. Okay, I'm an economist, I would say that, but these are interventions or policies which have attempted to give people on the demand side, parents and communities, greater agency. But they've had, in some cases, unexpected effects. We've seen negative outcomes in Minahil's case, and we've seen that people monitor or choose to monitor things that they don't have impacts on, which suggests we need to understand also the supply side. And I think what I really like about Jishnu's talk is that we've now got some evidence that a demand-side intervention, providing information to parents, feeds through into school responses, and we can actually trace through as to how schools have changed that production technology. So we've hypothesized that demand-side interventions might have a competitive effect, but we haven't really known the details of how schools respond. And I love the fact that we now can think about the theory more carefully and show that in the data. So great, demand and supply perhaps should have been the title of the session. In terms of the takeaway from Michelle's, I think it's just fascinating to see that the flat learning profiles and to have a simple model that helps us think that could be teacher ability. It's tempting to think it might be low teacher ability, but it needn't be teacher ability. And so having a model that makes us think it could be teacher ability or where the curriculum's centered is really, really important and useful. And I think that for me is the takeaway from your session. And I apologize that because of who you were with, you probably didn't get as many questions. And I will close there.